Okay, thank you all for joining us this evening for a talk with Darren Perry, the former chairman of the Northwestern Band of the Shoshone Nation on healing Bear River, healing Great Salt Lake. My name is Brooke Larson, and I am the Community Engagement Coordinator for the Environmental Humanities Graduate Program at the University of Utah. We're so honored to have Darren with us for this event tonight. And before I get into a land acknowledgement and introductions, I just want to give a quick shout out to Fiona and Hannah, two current students in our program who helped me organize this event and tonight are helping us out with tech support behind the scenes. I also want to acknowledge and express gratitude for our director, Jeffrey McCarthy. Thanks to his leadership, the Environmental Humanities Program received a multi-year grant from the Mellon Foundation in 2020 to further our program's efforts in community-engaged research and environmental justice. This funding helped make tonight's event possible. After Darren's talk, there will be time for questions from the audience, so please put those in the Q&A or chat boxes, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. This evening, I'm coming to you from so-called Salt Lake City, Utah, the unceded ancestral territory of the Goshute, Ute, Shoshone, and Paiute people. We're utilizing the technology of Zoom, which is based in San Jose, California, on the unceded territory of the Ohlone people. And because tonight we will be learning about the Bear River Massacre, I want to specifically acknowledge that the Environmental Humanities Program is located in the Fort Douglas section of the University of Utah campus. The land where my office now sits, where I am sitting right now tonight, used to be the base for the troops who murdered over 400 Shoshone people in one of the largest single mass killings of Native people in US history. Tonight, we tell this truth and reimagine what creative collaborations for healing and repair may surface from this place. We know merely acknowledging the land and this history is not enough. That is why the Environmental Humanities Program's mission is to integrate our need to know with our desire to act. That is why we invite leaders like Darren Perry to share their stories. We hope after this talk, you will consider supporting the Boa Ogoi Cultural Center, which is a Shoshone-led project for healing and restoration at the site of the Bear River Massacre. Darren will be talking about this project tonight, and we will put a link to the website in the chat. The connection between the Boa Ogoi Cultural Center and the imperiled Great Salt Lake may not be obvious at first, but we in the Environmental Humanities Program found this connection interesting and important for a few reasons. First, we believe to understand the root causes of pollution and neglect at the Great Salt Lake, we must learn about the attempted genocide of the indigenous people who have called the region home for time immemorial. We also think to find solutions to our current problems, we must follow the leadership of those indigenous to this place. The Shoshone-led project on the Bear River, the Great Salt Lake's largest tributary, is a model not only for ecological restoration, but also spiritual and cultural healing. So with that, I'm excited to finally introduce Darren and pass it over to him. Darren Perry is the former chairman of the Northwestern Band of the Shoshone Nation. He serves on the board of directors for the American West Heritage Center in Wellsville, Utah, the Utah State Museum Board, the Community Advisory Board for the Huntsman Cancer Institute, the Utah Humanities Board, and the PBS Utah Board of Directors. He attended the University of Utah and Weber State University and received his bachelor's degree in secondary education with an emphasis on history. Darren is the author of the Bear River Massacre, A Shoshone History, and teaches Native American history at Utah State. His passions in life are his wife, Melody, his 7 children, and 14 grandchildren. His other passion is his tribal family. He wants to make sure that those who have gone before him are not forgotten. Now I'll turn it over to you, Darren.
Thank you, Brooke, and thank you to the University of Utah for sponsoring this. And just before I begin, I got to give a quick shout out to my friend Nan out on Antelope Island. Oh my goodness, the awareness and what you're doing with your whole team is really commendable, and I'm very grateful that you've brought such an important part to the forefront. And so thank you so much for the work that you do. I've come to realize over a lifetime that when we reduce problem solving to just data and facts, and when we remove the emotions or the compassion to a problem, we lose some of the humanity that will make solving that issue important. And I think that's why tonight, the discussion we're going to have, that's why Native American perspective is so important to what we need to solve the problem. The problems we face in the environment and our waterways will only be solved by taking a look back. If you were to drive along Highway 91 just north of Preston, Idaho, you'll round a curve that opens to a panoramic view of the Bear River bottom. On a cold winter day, if you know just where you're looking, you can still see steam rising from the water's edge. 158 years ago, it was at that spot that some 700 members of the Shoshone Nation were spending their winter, as they had done for centuries. Hot springs nearby provided a welcome place for them to catch their breath, catch up with friends and family during the cold winter months. We called this place Mosodaguani, which means home of the lungs. A half a mile to the east, Patrick Connor in 1863 and his 220 cavalry soldiers from Camp Douglas, Utah, had this same bird's eye view in the early morning hours of January 29th, as they made their way down a ravine towards a sleeping village in steaming waters. When something terrible happens in a place where human lives have been lost, that place takes on a new meaning. The 14.6 acres at the World Trade Center, the beaches of Normandy, a homemade memorial at the side of the road where a fatal traffic accident occurred. Places that haunt and hurt for the wounds that they hold, but they still compel us to go back for some unexplainable comfort. Have you ever had a memory sneak out of your eye and roll down your cheek? I have that all the time when I think about the massacre of my people at Bear River. For thousands of years, the tribal elders would sit down with the children and they'd tell them stories. The stories were always the same. There was never a word out of place. It had to be that way. It had to be accurate. Our children needed to hear the stories as their elders had heard the stories, because in our culture, nothing is ever written down. You know, I went through this process with my grandmother, May Timbimbu Perry. She would sit for hours and she'd tell me these stories about how the coyote Sinav stole fire, or how the sun got its name, or how the bald eagle became bald. And then with reverence in her tone and sometimes a tear in her eyes, she would begin to relate the story of the massacre at Boa Ogoi. There's an old Indian saying that says, when an old Indian dies, a library burns. And you know, that was never as true as it was about my grandmother. As I grew older and I attended school, I developed this great love for history. And then one day, sitting in class, when the teacher's talking about Shoshone culture and history, I suddenly realized something. None of the stories that my grandmother told me were in our history books. But how could that be? I had always believed that historical events were an absolute. I'd believed that events that transpired over time had one conclusion. But as I've gotten older, I've really come to realize that history is about perspective. Whose perspective? And then one day it became really clear to me because I read a quote that was attributed to Winston Churchill. And he said that history is only written by the victors. Well, that made perfect sense then, why Native American histories are never written or seldom heard. Over the years, the riverbanks of Boa Ogoi became a site of honor where more than 400 bodies still lay. Frozen ground, the fear of returning soldiers prevented those few survivors from properly burying their dead. A few of the bodies were thrown into the river rather than leaving them for the animals and the elements. Chief Sagwitch led the survivors away from Boa Ogoi to seek safety elsewhere. The site today remains a sacred burial ground to those victims who were lost on that cold morning. But their voices still speak to me from the dust. If you're there at just the right time in the evening, my grandmother would tell me, you can hear the cries of the little ones crying for their mothers. Your senses tell you that you're among the spirits of more than 400 of Dama Appa, the great spirit who created us all. You don't have to see things as they were to know that a terrible injustice had taken place. You can feel it. But we remember the past. We remember the things that have happened because they allow us to succeed in the future. Someone once told me that never let your past experiences harm your future. Your past cannot be altered and your future doesn't deserve that punishment. In the years that followed, the story of the so-called Battle of Bear River has always been told from the soldier's perspective. But I know this was no battle. And my grandmother knew too. And she fought for years to tell our story. One day she sat me down as a young boy, and this is coming from a woman of color. And she said, Darren, no one has ever wanted to hear our story before. One day you will have to make them listen. But I haven't had to make people listen. People want to know. My Shoshone people referred to themselves as Niwa, which means the people. We looked upon the earth as not just a place to live, but something so sacred and special that we called her mother. She was always the provider of our livelihoods. You see, to my native people, the mountains and the streams and the plains stand forever, and seasons walk around annually. We traveled to different parts of this country when the game was plentiful and the seeds and berries were abundant. If you can imagine, it was a hard way of life. Probably never more than a few days away from starvation, but it was a happy life. Every member of the tribe played an important role in its survival. This family relationship was sacred, as I hope it is for you and your family. Spending time with family along the Bear River was a time of physical and spiritual rejuvenation, a respite after the long seasons of hunting and gathering. It was the elders' time to teach the children the values and educate them to the ways of the world. Stories that always taught lessons of life and how we live in a community. You see, by then, Western values, worldviews, had begun to creep in. Values that promote individual rights instead of indigenous values that promote obligations. Obligations to the past, obligations to the present, and obligations that we have to the future. Western worldviews tend to be scientific and skeptical, often requiring proof as a basis of belief. Indigenous worldviews, though, are based on a spiritually orientated society. This is a system based on a belief that there's a spiritual world. To Native people, the land and the water are spiritual. Western worldviews teach us that there is only one truth based on science or law. Indigenous worldviews, though, teach us that there can be many truths. Truths are dependent upon each individual's experiences. Western worldviews has a way of compartmentalizing society. Indigenous worldviews say that society operates in a state of relatedness. Everything and everyone is related. My grandmother used to tell me that all of the plants and animals were our kinfolk. We have a belief that people and objects in the environment are all connected. Law, kinships, spirituality reinforces this connectedness. Identity with my people always comes from connections. Western worldviews say that the land and its resources should be available for development and extraction for the benefit of humans. Indigenous worldviews believe that the land is sacred and is only given by the Creator to be carefully and lovingly maintained. Western worldviews judge your success by how well you've achieved your goals. Indigenous worldviews judge your success by the quality of your relationships with people. Western worldviews say that human beings are the most important in the world. Indigenous worldviews say that human beings are not the most important thing in the world. And Western worldviews teach that amassing wealth should always be for personal gain. Indigenous worldviews say that amassing wealth is important only for the good of the community. You know, the Iroquois Nation leadership has a beautiful concept about life. They don't make any decisions within their tribal government without considering what effects that decision will have on 7 generations ahead. Think about the implications for the future if that's how our leaders governed. I am thankful for the teachings of my people. The mountains are sacred. They carry within their peaks and valleys the substance needed for life. From the water running down the streams into our valleys, to the plants that are used as food and medicine, to the animals we harvest to feed our families. My grandmother would say, slow down, listen, and ponder the lessons that are being taught. There is a great natural order to the universe, of which man is a part. We are endowed with the ability to observe, learn, and imitate this order. It's what I like to call reciprocity. My people believe that the earth and all of its creations came into being by the Great Spirit as the creator. The Great Spirit put into place finely tuned parameters, systems, that would always sustain life. We were given careful instruction to take care of it. Our role was always that of a caretaker and not owner, a distinction that is not understood by Western values today. Those values that include ownership, extraction, and depletion. But to my native people, the lands belong to the Creator. And the Creator expects us to sustainably manage the resources that we have and to leave an inheritance for those yet to come. This was a lesson that I learned very early in my life at the sight of a grandmother. I remember picking choke cherries here in Avon, where I live in the Cache Valley today. I couldn't understand why she would pick 2 or 3 and then leave 2 or 3 on the same branch. And she told me one day that we leave those for the next people that come. And it was just a beautiful concept to me. The reality, though, of finally being able to tell our story from our perspective is really powerful. The purchase of the Bear River Massacre site, more than 550 acres in 2018, will help our people reconnect to this sacred space while providing a new emphasis for us as stewards. Voices that have been quiet for more than a century and a half are now being heard. Alliances are being built between community leaders, Utah State University, and us that will bring back what we thought has been lost forever. As important as it is to tell the story of the people, and I work hard every day to tell the story of our people, it's equally as important to tell the story of the land so that it can begin to heal. But where do we begin? How do we begin to attack and address the cultural and environmental injustices that have taken place for centuries? You know, environmental justice affirms the sacredness of Mother Earth, ecological unity, and the interdependency of all living species, and their right to be free from ecological destruction. Environmental justice demands that public policy be based on mutual respect and justice for all its people, free from any form of bias or discrimination. And we need to make sure that all of our efforts are truly sustainable and inclusive. We do this when we give marginalized people a voice. And not just people. We need to give a voice to the plants themselves. One of my favorite books, Robin Wall Kimmer's Braiding Sweetgrass. In it, she says, it's not enough to know the names of the plants. We need to know their songs. And I'm here to tell you tonight that my grandmother knew their songs. Another key part of this process was, as we looked at the land, we began to develop these partnerships with people that had a specific knowledge in a given field. Once we obtained the land, it was important for me to get the scientists involved that knew much more about the process than I did. My first visit was to Utah State University, to the College of Natural Resources. I told Mark Brunson and Chris Lukey that my goal, now that we own the land, was to restore that land, restore that watershed to what it would have looked like in 1863, partially using my grandmother's plant diary as a guide. I wanted to know if it was feasible. And I knew that I didn't possess the skill set to make those kinds of decisions. Our first interactions more than 4 years ago have brought us where we are today. Some of the things that we would like to accomplish at the site are going to require buy-in from landowners upstream. They will have to change some of their farming practices and techniques for us to accomplish our goals. How will they feel about doing things differently? How will they feel about the reintroduction of beaver into the ecosystem? Can they see the benefit of doing things in an environmentally friendly way, as opposed to how they've been doing things for centuries and decades? And lastly, accomplishing our goals is going to require ongoing funding from many different sources for many different years. This partnership, this collaborative partnership that we have developed with the Shoshone Nation, my people, and the scientists and students at Utah State University and others, has just begun. This will be a living, learning classroom for decades. It requires more than just removing non-invasive species and plants and trees and planting new ones. It will also involve restoring a watershed. This is not a project that we could ever do alone. As my good friend Will Munger says, healing begins when you bring people together. What we are doing at Bear River will not only symbolically, but literally have a long-lasting impact, not only on the Bear River, but on the future of the Great Salt Lake. As I've mentioned earlier, there was a day when my Shoshone people relied upon the goodness of the earth, provided to feed them and their families, healed their wounds, cured their ills. The Shoshone people, who are among the first Native Americans to dwell in the harshness and the abundance of the Salt Lake Valley, still believe in the wisdom that has been passed on by the elders, who always had a spiritual reverence for nature and the use of the earth. We were taught at an early age that everything that surrounds us has life in it and has a spirit, so that we can live in harmony with ourselves and our people and the surroundings. We have always believed that the earth is our mother. And we all believe in a real sense that the earth gives life. And that is what the elders have been trying to teach us all along. Ours is a story about a people who have been using the powers of the Great Salt Lake for thousands of years. Our people have been nourished and nurtured by this special gift. My grandmother, Darren Perry, in a tape recording video I found recently, said that our people used the waters of the Great Salt Lake and the plants and the herbs and the shrubs that grew along the banks for medical purposes for centuries. They healed our wounds, they healed our spirits, and always made us realize that this was a very sacred place. We have always believed in the healing powers of the water. My grandmother told me that there was medicine in the water that healed people. There is so much to do and learn from these simple remedies from the past. We must always look at the future and ask ourselves, how will we collectively steward the health of the lake and all of the people who rely upon it? And there's many. There is a growing consensus that the future of the Great Salt Lake is threatened by crisis. This crisis is overuse and climate change. We see this crisis more prominently now because Utah legislatures, leaders, are climbing into Black Hawk helicopters for the first time to see the receding lake levels on their own from the air. We see this crisis in the dry Bear River Migratory Bird Refuge when the migrating birds need it the most. We see it when we see the Utah legislature finally drafting bills to protect the Great Salt Lake. There's an emerging bipartisan consensus that things must change. Thank goodness, if we're to protect the lake for future generations. Let's just look at a few basic facts. The Great Salt Lake is the 8th largest saline lake in the world, and a combination of human activities and other things are putting that lake into jeopardy. Over the past few decades, droughts and wet cycles have caused huge fluctuations in the level of the lake and the area and the salinities. These variations, though, have masked what human impact has caused. But here's the reality. Human activity is causing the lake to shrink. Recent science has determined that consumptive water use in the watershed has depleted flows to the lake by almost 40%. When we break this down into economic sectors, we see that out of that 40%, 63% of that is used by agriculture, 11% by cities, 13% by solar ponds, and 13% by other uses. Those activities have lowered the lake level by almost 3 meters, decreased its area by 51%, and reduced its volume by 64%. And that's just from May of 2019. And I can say with a certainty that over the past 2 years, things have gotten much worse. Proposed water developments and climate change will make this situation even worse. The drying up of the Great Salt Lake isn't an option because it will be a danger to public health. A dry lake bed, as it is exposed, will expose salts and toxins and other sediments that get airborne that will cause respiratory and cardiovascular problems. I could go on and on about why it's a bad deal. We need to change our thinking and consider the health of not only the people along the Wasatch Front, but the health of the watershed that nourishes the lake and the health of our non-human species who rely on the lake as well. You see, scientists are finally discovering what indigenous leaders have taught for generations, that we're all connected. Politicians are finally discovering what the Iroquois already knew, that we must govern for the benefit of future generations. This is what young activists have saying when they are demanding climate justice. We cannot sacrifice the future for the sake of short-term profits. I promise you, there is not enough science in the world that will overcome our selfish behaviors. We are in the midst of a massive paradigm shift. Now is the time to braid together indigenous knowledge and values about stewardship with cutting edge biophysical science to create participatory watershed governance institutions and start to create policy to steward the Great Salt Lake for our future. What should these policies look like? We need to make sure that we ensure in-stream flows to the major tributaries that flow into the Great Salt Lake, like the Bear, the Jordan, and the Weber rivers. We need policy to promote regenerative agricultural practices upstream. And we need to support farmers and ranchers who are conserving water and who care and who are really trying hard to improve the health of the soil. I'm glad I live in an ag community because examples of rejuvenative ag means that they're working on things like cover crops, reducing tillage, building soil carbon, with them working on improving their grazing management, riparian buffers, which we're doing a lot of at the massacre site, and improving irrigation practices. All of these are little things that our ag community is doing and need to keep doing. We can all be involved in organizing land restoration activities that build resiliency to drought. One way to do this is to think slow, sink, and spread water across the landscape. Restoring beaver habitat and the health of the upper watershed riparian areas is a promising approach, and the one that we've looked at extensively. The restoration efforts at Boa Ogoi are good examples of this and could serve as a model for restoration across the watershed. By using our water rights at Bear River to restore Beaver Creek and riparian habitat along the Bear River, we are ensuring greater flows to the Great Salt Lake. Proposed legislation like House Bill 410 is a start, and other legislation that I've seen lately, but we need to make sure we stay organized and keep the political pressure on to get that legislation across the finish line. But the monster in the room that they don't seem to want to talk about is climate change. We have to increase political pressure for climate legislation, which will immediately reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There's an old Native American proverb that says, "We do not inherit the earth from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children." These are indeed difficult times. But what brings me hope is that thousands of people are coming together to say that our human being is connected to the well-being of the lake. And the well-being of the lake is connected to the well-being of the watershed and our climate. We are truly all connected. And the actions that we take in the next decade will affect 7 generations to come. Let's stay active. Let's stay engaged. Let's keep coming together to protect and steward the lake and each other. When science and indigenous wisdom collaborate, healing takes place. I'm honored to spend this evening with you, and I hope some of what I've said has been a help. I hope it gives us more of an emphasis to be better stewards, to lift where we stand. We all have a responsibility to take care of the things that we can take care of, and then be a voice and be an activist and call out leaders when needed, and do everything in our power to make sure that the next generations have what we've had and have what our grandparents had. So I'm honored to be here. So thanks, Brooke, and thanks, University of Utah. And thanks all of you who are working in your own little place to try to make a difference in this world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Darren. Really appreciate your words and your wisdom and sharing your story with us. I would love for folks to put any questions you have in the Q&A box. One question we have so far is, what are restorative projects currently planned for this coming year? Maybe I'll just tag something onto that. How can people get involved? Are there ways people can help what you're doing? I know you may have some volunteer days planned into the future, and also, we're here in a university program. There's a lot of people connected to the University of Utah who are joining. You have this great partnership with Utah State. I'm curious if, there's other opportunities for other university partners to help you out.
Yes, absolutely. And you can get a hold of me, and Brooke, please put my email in the chat. And so people can get a hold of me, reach out to me that way, and I'll put you in touch with someone that'll be kind of overseeing the volunteers. But we are going to have planting dates where we're planting willows and cottonwoods and other things that as the weather permits. And I'll tell you, there's nothing better than to see 100 to 200 people up there working together to make this a better place. And so right now we're just working really hard to do a lot of the land restoration. I am still raising money so we can build an interpretive center on the site. And, you can donate at boaogoi.org. I saw that in the chat earlier. But yeah, it's just all coming together in a time when the world needs it. And we need something good and wholesome that we can really focus on. And so we're very grateful for all of those who want to volunteer. And look, I'm a Utah season ticket holder football, and all my family has gone to the U. So I would love to have a lot of volunteers from the University of Utah. That would be really a wonderful blessing for me. Utah State University just happens to be 12 miles from the massacre site. And so it's just a perfect fit for what we're trying to do, but we could certainly use volunteers.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Darren. We have another question from Danielle Endres, who's wonderful affiliated faculty with our program. She asks, you use the term participatory watershed governance in reference to protecting the Bear River watershed and the Great Salt Lake. Can you speak more about what participatory watershed governance looks like in practice?
Well, I just went and I say that, and I don't want to get too deep into the weeds on science and some of these coalitions that we need to build, but we've got to have input from as many different sources as we can that are willing to not only say, hey, we're here to help, but really to jump in and help. Just for instance, what we're doing at the Bear River Massacre site, we have probably 8 to 10 different agencies, Sage Land Collaborative, BioWest, Utah Fish and Wildlife. So many different groups are collaborating using their specific skill sets to help us accomplish the goal. And I think as we tackle the Great Salt Lake, not one person or not one agency is going to be able to handle it. I think it's going to be a multi-agency approach for people to get involved, and as many different sources with different expertises that we can to share and come together and figure this thing out, the better off we're going to be. And so that's kind of what I meant by that.
Yeah, thank you, Darren. We also have some more questions about government institutions. We have a question about has the government made any efforts to ask forgiveness and ask help? So maybe could speak a bit to some of the institutions that you've gone to. I know we talked a bit about this, Darren, last week. So yeah, your experience
Well,
for that forgiveness, that apology.
yeah, we haven't received any apology for anything that happened, and so, you know, somebody says, has the church ever apologized? And my answer is no, and I don't expect them to. It's just not something that they normally do. And so I'm not going to hold my breath on that for sure. And I don't expect one. It would be nice to have one, but I don't expect one. And we're going to keep plowing ahead, doing our thing, whether we get one or not. Having said that, though, the church and the state of Utah has been very generous in donating, making donations to help us build that interpretive center. And so, you know, I don't want to say they've turned their back on it, because they certainly haven't. They've both given us sizable donations. And look, the state of Utah, this building is in Idaho. The fact that we got a wonderful appropriation from Speaker Brad Wilson and the legislature speaks volumes of, I think, the relationship that we built with the state of Idaho, and how we work together to try to accomplish something great. And so I know none of those people are on the call, but, you know, it's going to take more than just legislation. It's going to take indigenous wisdom. It's going to take people that can look at a problem different and try to solve it differently. And so, man, I would love to be involved with this stuff. It's just so important to our future generations. And so I'm not holding out any hope for any apologies. And I'm out working hard every day with those same governments and groups to try to see what we can do together to make a difference. And that's all I can do. And yeah, working hard to do that.
Yeah, thanks, Darren. Someone put in here a question wanting to hear more about your grandma's plant diary, and just learning more about the generations of passing on knowledge about plants. And I love that image of your grandma's plant diary that I was able to see. I wish I had it right now to share the screen, but maybe you could share a bit more about that and how that's informing the restoration efforts.
Yeah, you know, my grandmother was a product of the boarding schools, and she went to boarding school in California, came back, but she continued her education and went to high school, went to college, got her bachelor's degree in English. And then she began writing down all of the old stories that she'd heard as a child. So because of her and her extensive notes and the writings that she did, one part of those writings, she had a plant diary of probably 30 different plants that are found here in the Cache Valley in the mountains. Probably not even the Cache Valley, along the Wasatch Front, that are Utah plants. I think if most of you were to go on a plant walk in the mountains, you'd probably look at them as a weed, but they're used for food or medicine for the Shoshone people. And she physically drew pictures of these plants and wrote down the Shoshone word for them, and what they were used for, and even got so detailed as to write down what time of the year to pick them, because at certain times they'd be more potent than other times. And so, you know, finding this treasure of notes as I was writing this book, I just thought, oh my gosh, this has got to go in my book. So I put this with her writing in my book as part of the appendage, just so people can see, oh my gosh, that's not a weed you're looking at in the forest. That was used to cure the flu, or that was used to stop bleeding, or whatever else. And so, yeah, that plant diary is just a huge gift. And I'm not making a shameless plug for my book, but it's probably the only place you can find it. And you can get it on Amazon or other places, but it's only like $10. So the plant diary in itself is worth it to me. It just is just really a beautiful thing. And so I'm grateful that she left those, because in our tribe, Rios probably knows those, and maybe one or two more, but that is that knowledge would have been lost forever had she not wrote those things down and made drawings of them. And so, yeah, very grateful that she has that plant diary. And I took that plant diary to Utah State when I said, can we reintroduce these plants? And what Utah State scientists have done is gone through and done, based on climate change and the soil, they've done the studies already. This plant will do better than this plant will, but we're looking at the models to see what plants will thrive, what plants might need extra help. And so we're going to use that as a guide as we reintroduce some of these plants back into the system.
Yeah, I think that's just such a phenomenal partnership you all have formed, merging this traditional ecological knowledge, this cultural knowledge with the climate change projections. Just super impressive. So kind of building on that last question, we have a question about how we can apply this ancestral wisdom to the problems we face at the Great Salt Lake today. Would your grandmother talk about water conservation, negotiation with stakeholders? What advice do you think your grandmother would have for the problems facing the Great Salt Lake today?
Yeah, that's a great question. She was a little activist. She was a little spitfire. And so I don't know, I'd love to see her at the legislature today. That would be awesome because I'm not her. I approach things completely different. But, when you're raised looking at you look at a plant or an animal or water, and you don't feel like you have any more rights than they do, and you look at them as equals, you treat them differently and you treat the water differently. And I'm not saying we're ever going to get back there. I'm never going to get our lawmakers to look back there and go there. But it's almost like if we need to, because that paradigm shift has to take place. We have the science to fix things. It's not the science that's going to fix things. Our selfishness is bringing us down, and our unwillingness to park our big trucks and cars and do things a little differently. And the science is there, the indigenous part, the wisdom, and just making sure we honor the environment around us. That's not there. And I'm not sure what it's going to take to get there, but I'm working hard to try to, I think, educating people on it, having them look at things differently, I think is a start. And especially our youth. I find the youth are much more engaged in this process than some of us old timers that just don't want to change. So, but I think there's hope, but I think we need both. We've got to change the way we look at things.
So there's another question about kind of building on this climate change thread. Are there efforts to compile place-based stories, narratives, indigenous wisdom of changes in climate? So I think that's getting at how from the stories from your grandmother, these stories that have been passed down in your tribe, how could those be used to record the changes in climate we're seeing?
Yeah, we're just beginning to start this. And so, some of the work that Professor Sarah Klain's done, she's into this, but she's in social work and how our interactions socially affect some of this stuff. And I'm really appreciative of that because that's something I don't get at all. I just know what I know. And so, but we're just beginning to scratch the surface on how we can use these stories that some of them I shared tonight and to really be impactful in how it can make a difference going forward. I don't have any specifics on it right now, but that's part of the process. It's got to be part of the process. And since this is such a new, we've been doing the restoration work there for about a year now, but that has to be part of the ongoing discussions.
Yeah, thanks, Darren. So we have a question about the Great Salt Lake. You mentioned the Shoshone people have used Great Salt Lake and the plants surrounding it for medical purposes for centuries. Someone's curious if there are other ways it has been culturally significant. I'm personally thinking of, the project we were talking about that one of our students, Hannah, has been working on with you all about Antelope Island and the cultural significance of Antelope Island for the Shoshone people. So maybe that's something you'd want to speak to a bit more.
Yeah, in fact, Hannah's work with our tribe, we just produced the tribe. We have a filmmaker that just produced a 5-minute video that's going to be shown in the visitor center out there, I believe. And but the work she's doing, Hannah's doing, and others to just highlight the Shoshone people and how we viewed the island, Antelope Island, and the bison that are there, and the significance of all of those things to the tribe itself, talking about those relationships that we have and why they're so important. And so, that's just one little aspect of what has been done. But if you think about it, that's just the bison. We can do that on every level. We can do it on all the plants. And I think I told you in Park City the other night, our creation story comes from Antelope Island. And so we haven't really even explored that, but a creation story is based in myth. And so, as a very privileged Native American today, and I think I've lived a very privileged life, I hear our creation story and I really honor that, but I think in my head, that's not really what happened. I mean, the coyote didn't open this box and we all jumped out and started running around and that became the Shoshone people. I mean, but symbolically, how our creation story uses animals and not people to explain values and other things like that, that really tells me the importance of our animals and our plants and everything else, because that's how we explain, that's how we teach our children, is through all of those different mediums. And so when we can do something like highlight the bison and what that meant to us as a people and what it means to the island, then it's a start. And we've got a lot of work to do, and hopefully to highlight other areas that maybe will be more important to what we're talking about tonight, the lake and how we can save it. So I'd love to start doing some videos like that. So.
Well, thank you so much, Darren. We're coming to the end of the hour. So we'll start wrapping up, but thank you so much to everyone who joined us. Thank you for your wonderful questions. I put Darren's email in the chat, so if your question didn't get answered, you can reach out to him and also reach out about volunteer opportunities. And we did record this, so I'll also be sending that out if you all would like to share and watch afterwards as well. And please check out the Boa Ogoi website. Help support their efforts. And thank you so much, Darren. Thank you so much for sharing your story, your wisdom, and being here with us this evening.
Thank you, Brooke. Can't wait to see you again.
Yeah.
Thank you for everything that you do.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Have a
Take
good
care,
night,
everyone. Thanks.